Hi, everyone. My name's Olivia Bene. I work with Kristen and Mary Margaret at the apiary here at Champlain, and I'm very excited to talk to you about bees today. Although I do wish I could be there with you, I am very excited that I still have the opportunity to discuss squash bees and their importance today. So, I chose squash bees and their relationship with the genus Cucurbita. So what this is mainly your family of squashes. So summer squash, winter squash, zucchini, pumpkins, many gourds, but not cucumbers. Just we're not going to talk about cucumbers. And these are typically found all across North America, all the way up from Ottawa down to Mexico, which is also conveniently where all of the squash bees are located. So these bees are called squash bees because they only gather from plants within this genus. So they're also found all around North America. And what's really cool about squash bees is that when you think of a bee and you think of a bee nest, typically you think in a tree or like in a hole in a wall somewhere. They actually dig 6 to 12 inches into the ground. And that's where they lay their eggs and they take all their pollen and their nectar. It's cool. They don't have a colony mindset like typical bees do. They're very independent. So the females are the ones that actually dig the nest to store pollen for their offspring because once they mate, then that's where they lay their eggs and they seal up the nest and they continue on. This type of bee is actually up before sunrise. It's one of the earliest rising bees because that's when the squash plants, the flowers open, the blossoms open. And actually, if you look in the blossoms of the squash plants, you can usually see the male ones asleep by noon when most of the other bees are just getting up and starting to pollinate. So they carry pollen in their hind legs. There are these long hairs that stick out that are where the pollen grains get trapped, which is different than with honeybees who actually have what's called a basket where they store their pollen as they're going around. And this is because of the nature of the pollen grains with the squash plants are much thicker and heavier than traditional flowers, so they need to be a little bit different. And squash bees are so important. A lot of people don't really know they exist because they look very similar to honeybees and they're up very early and finish very early in the day, so people don't really see them. But squash bees pollinate 2/3 of commercially grown squash. It has been proven that without these bees, there would be no squash in the agricultural community. They're a huge, huge deal. So if we get into more specifics about the bees, we talk about male versus female, which both of them gather nectar. And you can tell the difference between a male and a female because the female usually has the long hairs because she's the only one that carries the pollen grains. And the male usually has a yellow spot on their face, and the female face is usually very dark. The female is the one to dig the nest for the offspring and the one to leave the eggs behind once they mate because the males are sleeping in the flowers. The females come out in the bright early morning and they go to start pollinating and they see the males and they end up mating. And to be ahead of the game, the males end up floating around going flower to flower, and then at the end of the day, they sleep in flowers. So that way, when the females are up and ready, the males will be right there, ready to go. And because of that, because of from going flower to flower to meet with the females, the males are accidental pollinators. The males actually, from this process, do 10% of the pollinating of the squash bee population, which is kind of funny, just if you think about it. They're just accidentally doing their job. I think it's cool. And so squash bees are interesting and a little different because they have their nests in the ground. When farmers are tilling, it disrupts the squash bee community. It crushes the nest. It kills all the eggs. Anyone that's in the nest is gone. So it's actually been proven that farms that don't till have 3 times more bees, squash bees, than those who do till because they're not disrupting the bees. They also tend to prefer irrigated farms versus non-irrigated. The population doubles if you're at an irrigated farm versus non, which is rather interesting. And then everyone knows pesticides are bad, but specifically with squash bees, because of the nature of the plants they're pollinating, there's a lot of tiny pests and bugs that eat at these plants that farmers will use pesticides to get rid of, but then that pesticide gets on the squash bee itself and gets in the pollen, and then the bee takes the pollen and brings it to their offspring, and then the offspring ingests it, and then they die, and it affects the generation of the bee. So natural remedy is the best way to go for that, to keep the bees around. And for big farmers and for anyone who likes to have a little garden in their backyard, if you want to help the squash bees, just plant in the same area year to year. Don't be rearranging your garden design every year. Have a section where you plant your squashes and your pumpkins and your gourds and all that good stuff that you want to grow, because the bees tend to prefer to build their nests under the fallen leaves of those plants, and if they're constantly shifting, then the soil tends to get changed, and it makes it harder for them to build their nests, and it becomes a whole issue. And these I just found really interesting. On the left is a little doodle that compares a squash bee and a honeybee. Notice how they're kind of similar, but they are overall different. And then a bumblebee and a carpenter bee for comparison. And then on the right, on the top, there's a squash bee and a honeybee, a more realistic drawing compared with a bumblebee. And then the bottom is the two abdomens of a squash bee and a honeybee, and that's where you can really begin to see the difference, because the honeybee is black and orange, and it's much thicker, and squash bees are much darker and thinner stripes. So that's all I have to say about squash bees. Thank you for taking the time to come and learn about bees, and they're very important, and don't forget that. Have a great rest of your day.